you're looking at nothing. Not an object. A handful of pale streaks and one bright dash of white. Sitting on a dark background. There's no thing there. No color you could name, no surface you could touch. And yet your brain has already told you, without being asked, that this is glass. Cold, hard, transparent, fragile glass, holding wine, catching the light of a window you cannot see. That is one of the strangest tricks in all of painting. And here is what makes it strange. Glass is invisible. You cannot paint a transparent object because a transparent object, by definition, is not there. There's nothing to put on the canvas. It has no color of its own. You can see straight through it. So, how do you paint a thing that is, optically, an absence? For more than 200 years, the greatest painters in Europe basically couldn't. They could paint gold, fur, marble, human skin, the individual hairs on a dog. And they would still hand you a glass that looked like a lump of grey jelly. And then, in a single generation in one small country, a handful of painters cracked it so completely that they made empty air look more real than anything solid in the picture. This is the story of how and why it took so agonizingly long. And I want to be clear that this isn't a story about painters getting better at their craft, because that's the obvious explanation, and it's wrong. The people who couldn't paint glass in 1500 weren't clumsy. They were, some of them, the most technically gifted human beings who have ever lived. Leonardo could paint the moisture in a woman's eye, and he'd still have struggled with a plain wine glass, for reasons that had nothing to do with his hands and everything to do with two things that simply hadn't arrived yet in his world. One of them, a material, one of them, a way of seeing. When both finally showed up in the same place at the same time, painters who were arguably less gifted than Leonardo did. Something Leonardo couldn't. That's the interesting part. It's a story where the tools and the materials matter more than the genius, which is not how we usually tell art history and is exactly why it's worth telling. There it is. A lobster, a silver-mounted drinking horn, a half-peeled lemon, and two glasses that seem to be made of actual light. Willem Kalf painted this in 1653 at the exact moment the problem got solved, and he's showing off. Because he can, and because 30 years earlier nobody on earth could have done it. To understand what he's doing, you have to understand why it was impossible for so long. And that starts with the thing nobody wants to admit about glass. Because here's the uncomfortable fact at the center of this whole story. We treat realism in painting as a straight line. Cave paintings at one end, photographs at the other, and a steady climb of skill in between. Glass proves that's a lie. Painters got dramatically worse at certain things and better at others, depending on what materials they had, what their culture wanted, and what ways of seeing were available to them. A Dutch painter in 1653 could paint a wine glass that a greater genius in 1500 simply could not. Not because he was more talented, but because he stood at the exact meeting point of the right glass, the right method, the right market, and the right moment. Realism isn't a ladder everyone climbs. It's a set of specific problems, each one solved once in a particular place, by particular people, often for reasons that have as much to do with furnaces and merchants as with genius. Glass is the clearest proof of that, literally the clearest, because you can date the solution almost to the decade. A painter's entire job is to describe surfaces. Glass doesn't have one. Not one you can see, anyway. So the painter has to do something almost philosophical. Instead of painting the object, they have to paint everything the object does to the light around it. Glass isn't a thing you paint. It's a set of events you paint and hope the viewer assembles into a thing. Let's break glass down into what it actually does to light, because every one of these is a separate painting problem, and you have to solve all of them at once or the illusion dies. 1. It's transparent. You see the background through it, but shifted, darkened, tinted, because the glass isn't perfectly clear and it's got wine or water in it. So the painter has to paint the background twice, once normally and once again altered, seen through the glass. Two versions of the same wall, and if they don't line up exactly right, the glass looks solid. 2. It reflects. The surface throws back a bright, sharp image of the light source, a window, a candle, usually as one or two hard, brilliant highlights. Get these wrong, and the glass looks matte, like clay. Light bends as it passes through, so anything behind the glass. The stem of the glass itself, the edge of the table, a lemon. gets distorted, offset, sometimes flipped. The base of a wine glass will chop a straight line into steps. Paint that line straight, and the glass looks fake instantly. 4. And this is the killer. It has almost no edges. Glass doesn't have an outline. There's no dark line where the glass stops and the air begins, because you can see through the edge just like you can see through the middle. So the painter has to define the entire shape of the object without ever drawing its border, purely through what's happening on and behind and inside it. Transparency, reflection, refraction, and no edges, all at once, in a medium that is itself flat and opaque. That's the wall these painters spent 2 centuries failing to climb. And to see how badly they failed at first, we have to go back to the man who painted a dog's individual hairs correctly in 1434, and still couldn't do a wine glass. But before that, sit with how genuinely backwards this problem is, because it's the reason it defeated so many brilliant people. Every other subject in painting rewards the same instinct. Look at the thing and paint the thing. You want to paint a red apple? You look at the apple and you put down red. You want to paint gold? You look at the gold and you find its color. The thing you're looking at and the thing you paint are the same thing. Glass breaks that completely. When you look at a wine glass and try to find its color, there is no color. When you try to find its surface, you see through it. When you try to find its edge, there isn't one. The object refuses to be looked at directly. Everything you can actually see belongs to something else. The wall behind it, the window in front of it, the wine inside it, the table under it. The glass is only visible as its effect on its neighbors. And painting a thing purely through its effect on other things is a genuinely different mental act from painting a thing directly. That's the leap. It took 2 centuries to make it. Jan van Eyck could paint anything. The convex mirror on the back wall of the Arnolfini portrait reflects the entire room, including 2 figures standing where you are. It's one of the most astonishing passages of observation in the history of art, and it's the size of a coaster. So you'd think glass would be easy for him. But look at the actual window. The panes are there. The light comes through. But the glass itself is barely described. It reads more as a leaded pattern, a decorative screen, than as transparent material with weight and depth. And here's the tell: Van Eyck, and everyone in the North for a century, is brilliant at reflective glass. The mirror, which is really just a curved metal back surface throwing back an image. But genuinely transparent glass, a clear vessel you look through, they mostly avoid. When they do include a glass, it's usually thick, greenish, and half opaque, because that's the only kind of glass they had, and frankly, the only kind they could paint. Which points at the second reason this took so long. And it has nothing to do with skill. For most of history, painters couldn't paint clear glass, because clear glass barely existed. And it's worth being precise about what Van Eyck did and didn't crack, because it maps the whole problem. He nailed reflection. The mirror is pure reflection, a bright image bouncing off a curved surface, and he's perfect at it. He was decent at colored, semi-opaque glass. The leaded window works as a pattern of light. What he couldn't do, what nobody could do yet, was the full package, a clear vessel you look through that reflects and refracts and has no edge, all at once. He had 2 of the 4 problems solved and no way to attempt the other 2, because the object that would have taught him, a flawless, clear glass on the table in front of him, did not yet exist in his world. You cannot copy an optical effect you have never seen. Genius wasn't the missing ingredient. The missing ingredient was the glass. Think about what glass was. For most of the time painters existed. Roman glass, medieval glass, early Renaissance glass. It was thick, bubbled, cloudy, tinted green or brown by iron impurities in the sand. Beautiful, but not clear. You couldn't see cleanly through it, which means there was nothing for a painter to master, because the object in front of them wasn't doing the transparency trick in the first place. You can't paint crystal clarity from a cloudy green beaker. There's no clarity there to copy. Then, slowly, that changed, and it changed in Venice. On the island of Murano, glassmakers spent generations perfecting a nearly colorless, brilliant, thin glass they called cristallo, because it looked like rock crystal. It was a jealously guarded state secret. The glassmakers were forbidden to leave the Republic on pain of death. For the first time in history, a genuinely clear, reflective, refractive object existed. A thing that did everything glass is supposed to do, in front of a painter's eyes. And this is the part people miss about art history. Sometimes the breakthrough isn't in the studio at all. It's in a workshop full of furnaces on an island in a lagoon, run by men who never painted anything. The painters didn't advance first and drag the objects up to meet them. The object advanced. The glassmakers got better, decade by decade, at pulling the iron out of the sand and the bubbles out of the melt. And painting followed. For once, you can watch technology lead and art chase. Every increase in the clarity of real glass gave painters a harder, more spectacular optical puzzle to copy, and slowly taught their eyes what perfect transparency even looks like. The clearer the glass got, the more there was to paint. The Murano furnaces were, without knowing it, writing the curriculum. And notice who's holding the line here. This is Clara Peeters, a Flemish woman painting around 1605, decades before the men usually credited with cracking glass. And she was so confident in her rendering of reflective surfaces that she hid tiny self-portraits in the gleam on her silver and gold vessels, a signature you need a magnifying glass to find. The Venetian glass in the background of this painting is a status symbol twice over. Once because such glass was fabulously expensive, and once because being able to paint it at all was a flex almost no one could match. So the reason nobody could paint glass until around 1650 is really two reasons braided together. The object didn't exist in clear form until Venice made it, and the technique to paint transparency hadn't been invented yet. Both had to arrive, and they arrived together in the wealthiest square mile on earth at that moment, the Dutch Republic. The Dutch had three things nobody else had all at once. They had the money. Amsterdam was the richest city in Europe, and its merchants wanted paintings of their expensive things. They had the glass. Venetian imports and their own increasingly clear production, sitting on real tables in real houses, and they had invented a new way of painting that turned out to be the exact key that fit the lock. And there was a fourth thing, easy to overlook: they had a reason to care. This was a Protestant republic with no royal court commissioning grand religious epics, and a huge middle class of merchants who wanted, instead, paintings of the world they actually lived in. Their food, their tables, their imported luxuries. Still life, a genre other traditions treated as minor and beneath serious ambition, became in Holland a central, competitive, high-status form. And when a whole country's best painters pour their ambition into painting objects on a table, and the most impressive object you can possibly paint is a clear glass, you get an arms race. Every painter is trying to outglass the last one. That competitive pressure, aimed at exactly this problem, for exactly this market, is what turned a slow crawl into a sudden breakthrough. The glass got solved fast in the end, because, for the first time, solving it was the whole game. Here's the key. Earlier painters worked light to dark on a white ground. They started bright. The Dutch still life masters flipped it. They worked on a dark, toned ground, starting from shadow and building up to light, adding brightness in thin, translucent layers, and then, at the very end, hitting the highest points with thick, opaque, brilliant white. And that method, dark first, light last, built-in glazes, is, it turns out, precisely how you paint glass. Because look at what glass actually is. Visually, it's mostly the dark background showing through, with a few bright reflections floating on top, a dark base with sharp light accents. The Dutch tonal method wasn't invented for glass, but it described glass perfectly. Pieter Claesz, working in Haarlem, could take two glasses, a sturdy squat Roma and a tall thin pass glass, and make you feel, just through the reflections he chose, that one is heavy cheap glass and the other is delicate and fragile. He's not painting the glass. He's painting the specific way each one fails to fully block the light and letting you feel the difference in your hand. And this is the deep reason the Dutch cracked it, and the Italians, for all their genius, mostly didn't. The great Italian tradition was built on drawing, on disegno, on line, on knowing the true shape of a thing and laying it down with authority. That is exactly the wrong toolkit for glass. Because glass has no true line and no fixed shape. It's a shimmer of accidents. The Dutch tradition was built on tone, on value, on the exact brightness of every patch, on painting the world as a mosaic of lights and darks rather than a scaffold of edges. Glass is invisible to a line and obvious to a value. A painter trained to see the world as patches of brightness was, without meaning to be, perfectly equipped for the one object that is nothing but patches of brightness. The Italians had the better glass first, through trade with Venice. The Dutch had the better eyes for it. It's the eyes that won. Willem Claesz Heda takes it further and solves the hardest sub-problem of all, refraction. Follow the edge of the table behind one of his glasses, or the stem of the glass seen through the bowl. Watch it bend, break, step sideways, offset itself where it passes through the glass and the liquid. That's the thing that took the longest to conquer, because it requires the painter to do something almost unnatural. To paint a line wrong, to paint the table edge crooked, exactly as crooked as the glass makes it, and trust that the viewer's brain will read the crookedness as proof of transparency rather than as a mistake. This is the intellectual heart of the whole breakthrough. For 200 years, painters drew what they knew. A table edge is straight, so they painted it straight, even behind a glass. The Dutch masters painted what they saw. A table edge behind a glass is broken, so they painted it broken. It sounds simple. It is the single hardest habit in representational painting to break, and breaking it is what finally made glass appear. They stopped painting the object and started painting the optics. And the moment they did, the empty air on the canvas turned to crystal. Heda also does something quietly clever with edges. Since glass has no outline, he defines the rim of a glass not with a line, but with a broken, flickering highlight. A dotted trail of tiny bright and dark touches that your eye reads as a hard, cold edge catching the light. There's no border there. There's a rhythm of light, and you supply the border yourself. And there's a psychological trick underneath all of this that the Dutch understood better than anyone before them. Your brain desperately wants to see objects, and it will do most of the work for free. Give it 4 bent lines and 2 highlights in roughly the right places, and it will hand you a whole wine glass, complete with weight and coldness, and the sound it would make if you tapped it, none of which is on the canvas. The painter's job isn't to render the glass. It's to give the brain just enough correct clues, and no wrong ones, so that the brain builds the glass itself. A single wrong clue, one highlight in the wrong place, one line that should bend and doesn't, and the illusion collapses and you're looking at grey smears again. So the skill isn't adding detail. It's knowing the 4 or 5 things that absolutely must be right, and having the nerve to leave everything else out. Heda leaves out almost everything. That's why his glasses look more real than glasses painted with 10 times the effort. Which brings us back to Kalf and the peak. By 1653, the problem is not just solved, it's become a playground. Kalf takes the darkest possible background, near black, and sets a clear Venetian glass against it, and now every weapon is firing at once. The dark ground shows straight through the empty glass. A lemon peel and a silver mount refract and distort inside the bowl. 2 or 3 brilliant, thick, opaque highlights sit on the rim and the curve, painted last, standing physically proud of the surface. And the whole edge of the glass is described without a single outline, purely by the meeting of dark background and bright reflection. Kalf understood that glass looks most like glass when it's surrounded by darkness, because darkness gives the few highlights maximum contrast, the same borrow. The darkness trick that a candlelight painter uses for fire, and that Rubens used to make skin glow against fur. A bright highlight on a bright background is nothing. A bright highlight on black is a spark of cold fire. So Kalf drowns the room in shadow and lets 3 dabs of white do the work of an entire wine glass. Objects, as one description of his work puts it, mysteriously and luminously emerge from the dark, and the play of light on their surfaces, the reflections, the refractions, the transparency, becomes the real subject of the painting, not the lobster, not the wealth, the light itself. And Kalf pushed the illusion to a place that's almost showing contempt for how hard this used to be. He'd set clear glass in front of dark porcelain, behind bright silver, beside a peeled lemon whose rind spirals down over the table edge, and let all of it refract and reflect through the glass at once, so that a single wine glass contains, in distorted miniature, half the objects on the table. The glass becomes a lens, a mirror, and a window simultaneously, and every one of those functions is painted correctly in a passage of canvas a few centimeters wide. 100 years earlier, painters couldn't get one of those effects right on its own. Kalf stacks 3 of them inside a single glass and makes it look effortless, which is the surest sign of all that a problem has been truly, permanently solved. It stops being a struggle and becomes a flourish. The thing that broke 2 centuries of masters is now just a nice way to show off at the end of a painting. And there's a reason glass, of all things, obsessed these painters beyond just the technical challenge. Glass meant something. In the Dutch Vanitas tradition, paintings built to remind you that life is short and pleasure is fleeting. An empty glass, a tipped glass, a fragile glass beside a skull was a symbol of exactly that fragility. Here today, shattered tomorrow. A thing that is beautiful and clear and full of light and could break if you looked at it wrong. So when a painter spent weeks conquering the optics of a single wine glass, they weren't only showing off, they were painting mortality. The most fragile, transient, breakable thing on the table, rendered in the most difficult technique available, as if the difficulty itself were part of the point. The clear glass was the hardest thing to paint and the easiest thing to break, and both of those facts were the message. Master the impossible object and use it to remind the viewer that nothing lasts. There's something almost unbearably fitting in that. These painters had just won a 200-year war to make transparent glass look permanent and solid and real on a panel. And the thing they chose to do with that hard-won permanence was to paint a symbol of impermanence, to use the most durable illusion they could make to say, none of this lasts. The glass in the painting outlives the glass on the table, outlives the man who owned it, outlives the man who painted it. And it's there to tell you that you won't. The technique defeats time. The subject reminds you that you can't. Both things are true in the same 3 dabs of white paint on the rim. So why couldn't anybody paint glass until 1650? Because 2 impossible things had to happen first, and they had to happen at the same time and in the same place. The object had to exist. Clear cristallo glass, invented and perfected in Venice, replacing the cloudy green lumps that had nothing to teach a painter. And the technique had to exist. The Dutch tonal method, dark ground to bright highlight, built-in translucent glazes, which turned out by pure luck to be the exact recipe for describing a transparent thing. Neither one alone was enough. Venice made the glass, Holland made the method, and in the middle of the 17th century, in the richest merchant houses in Europe, the two finally met on the same table. And then a handful of painters made a discovery that still sounds almost like a paradox. To paint the most solid-seeming, brilliant, present object in the room, you paint almost nothing at all. You paint the dark behind it. You paint the few places light bounces off it. You paint the lines behind it, bending wrong. And you leave the object itself, the glass, the thing you're supposedly depicting, as a hole in the middle of all that, a space you never actually touch with a describing brushstroke. The glass is the one thing in the painting that isn't painted. It's the gap your eye fills in. Here's what you can do now, forever. The next time you're in a gallery and you pass a Dutch still life with a wine glass that stops you dead, that looks wet, cold, breakable, real, get close. Find the background showing through it and check whether the painter bothered to shift and darken it. Find the 1 or 2 thick white highlights and notice they're the only opaque marks on the whole glass. Follow a line behind the glass and watch it break, and then look for the edge of the glass and realize there isn't one. There's no outline anywhere. The whole cold, hard shape is built from nothing but light and darkness and a few bent lines floating in the air, describing an object that was never actually painted. And here's the last thing, the thing that makes this more than a technical story. What those Dutch painters really discovered wasn't how to paint glass. It was a new relationship with the truth. For 200 years, European painting was built on painting what you know. The true shape, the true line, the ideal form, the thing as your mind understands it to be. Glass could not be painted that way, because glass has no true form. It only has appearances. To paint it, you had to abandon what you know and paint only what you see. The broken line, the shifted background, the accidental flare of light, the world exactly as it strikes the eye, before the brain tidies it up. That's a philosophical shift disguised as a still life. It's the same move that, 200 years later, the Impressionists would build an entire revolution on: paint the seeing, not the knowing. The Dutch got there first, quietly, by staring at a wine glass until they were willing to paint it wrong enough to look right. It took 200 years and a state secret from Venice to work out that the way to paint the clearest thing in the room is to paint everything except the thing itself. Glass is the proof that in painting, as in a lot of things, the hardest object to capture is the one you can see straight through.